The sport of boxing, barbaric as it is, holds a special place for the Adams family. Dad was a talented light heavyweight fighter in the early 1950s, holding several regional titles in eastern Oklahoma and western Arkansas. And had it not been for boxing scholarships, he may never have had the opportunity to attend college at all. In this regard, for Dad, the sport was a means to break the cycle of generational poverty, and boxing welcomed him through the door of education into a life of enlightenment that few of his childhood peers could have imagined. So in 1971, now in his late 30s, he sought to pay forward his societal debt by forming a boxing team, coaching them in the art of self-defense while mentoring the boys in life lessons and good sportsmanship. He coached 12 boys that year, but it was his oldest son, Len, who had one of the most auspicious starts, winning the first tournament in which he fought, and showed well in those that followed. He was good, and as the season wore on, he seemed primed to follow in his father's prodigious footsteps. But there was trouble ahead, the kind of trouble that he never saw coming, the kind of trouble where survival is looked back on with gratitude. This was 147 pounds worth of trouble, and his name was Wawa Trahan. Wawa was a multi-sport athlete from Walters, county seat of Cotton County in southwestern Oklahoma. He was one of those rare individuals whose presence alone commanded attention. Straight out of nowhere, he showed up to fight in one of the tournaments midway through the season, and from his first appearance in the ring, people knew his name. He was unquestionably Native American, good-looking with long, straight, shoulder-length hair that was black as coal, appearing as if he had been plucked directly out of a 1957 cowboy western movie. His muscular upper body was overshadowed only by his stylish, blue velvet, white-trimmed boxing trunks, with matching tassels that danced from the top of his white knee-length boxing shoes. But it was his aggressive, bob-and-weave fighting style that was unmistakable, possessing punching power not often seen in a boxer of his weight class. His opponents rarely finished the fight, and when they did, most paid a heavy price with flesh and blood. Each time Wawa left the ring, it was to raucous cheers, appearing as though he had merely finished a light workout. Those who saw him fight were indeed privileged to witness a rare athlete at the peak of his sport, seemingly gifted with a once-in-a-generation dose of talent, publishing his genius with each left jab, broadcasting his mastery with each right cross, carving out his legacy one victory at a time, for all to behold and appreciate. Truly, Wawa was a phenomenon. Unfortunately for Len, he and Wawa were contenders in the same weight class. As the season wore on, it was purely by the luck of the draw that Len and Wawa never faced each other in the ring. While Wawa racked up victory after victory and title after title, Len always found himself on the opposite end of the bracket, sheltered from the carnage that lurked on the other side. Whether by coincidence or divine providence, tournament after tournament, fate shined Len's way. Certainly, he was aware of Wawa's popularity and prowess, and the prospect of fighting him came to occupy an increasingly significant amount of his headspace. And though a small part of his psyche was content to imagine a decisive win over Wawa as an underdog, he foresaw, in his darker moments, his own humiliating defeat, rife with loosened teeth, heavy bruising, and prolific bloodshed. More often than not, a complete avoidance of contemplating it at all was the rule. Sometimes, it's better not to think of such things. Unfortunately, failing to plan for such a moment is a recipe for a plan to fail in the moment. The last tournament of the season was upon them. It was to be held in the Cameron University Varsity Gym in Lawton, not far from Wawa's hometown of Walters. Wawa entered the tournament as a huge favorite, undefeated and virtually untested, having won every match either by knockout or by unanimous decision. This tournament would prove to be no different, seeming to be utterly invincible in 2 easy wins to advance to the finals. On the season, Lynn had more wins than losses, but he hadn't really contended for a tournament title since early in the year. In the first round of the tournament, however, he fought well, winning a close fight, then followed with an easy win in the second round against an opponent who was really no match for him at all. But as he changed his clothes in the locker room afterward, those dark thoughts resurfaced and drifted to that dreaded worst-case scenario he had so anxiously imagined those many times before. He and Wawa would finally meet in the tournament finals on Saturday night. Every single member of the Waurika boxing team made the trip to Lawton on Saturday, anxious to support Lynn in his effort to derail the Wawa Express. There were a couple of other team members who would also fight this night, including brother Keith, but most came just to watch Lynn and Wawa fight. Young Eric watched the early fights and cheered as Keith won a stunning victory in the 90-pound weight class, his first tournament championship of the season. As Keith exited the ring with Dad, young Eric wondered if this might be a good omen for the Adams brothers, perhaps the beginning of a string of upsets. But as he thought about it further, he couldn't shake the ominous feeling that his brother Lynn was in serious danger of significant bodily injury. Wawa was just too strong, too mythical, too legendary. The obvious questions began flooding into his head. Why is no one doing anything? Is there anyone at all that really questions what will be the outcome? Doesn't anyone care about what's going to happen? Is there a doctor standing by? The last question lingered for several moments, then crystallized into a plausible course of action. He resolved to talk to Wawa before the fight, to petition for any measure of grace or goodwill that Wawa might be inclined to confer in Lynn's regard. It was, perhaps, a desperate gesture, but he recognized the hopelessness of the situation and deemed his judgment sound as he walked toward the locker room where Wawa was changing. Upon entering, he was met with the musty smell of sweating men, made all the more distinct by the warm humidity of the room. It was a large locker room, in comparison to those from other venues throughout the season, and somewhat cleaner too. He looked around, but only momentarily, before locating Wawa's familiar figure on the far end of one of the benches. He stood up, wearing nothing but a jock strap, revealing well-toned gluteal muscles and powerful-looking legs. Young Eric had never spoken to Wawa, other than a casual hello in passing. For that matter, Eric assumed Wawa would have no idea as to who he even was. As he approached him, Wawa stood up and pulled on his trademark blue velvet trunks. Standing next to Wawa, young Eric felt even younger and smaller. "Hi, Wawa. I'm Eric. You're going to be fighting my brother Lynn tonight." Eric spoke the words, but they seemed to come from someplace else. His chagrin was apparent from the moment their eyes met, unsure of what to say next, but figured he'd play off of any reaction he received. It was obvious to anyone watching that he was starstruck, that awkward mix of joy and terror at meeting someone quite famous for the first time. Wawa stared down at him discerningly, pausing for a full 5 seconds before the seriousness in his face morphed into a broad smile of recognition. He chuckled at Eric's nervousness, then proceeded to lighten the moment further. "Hey, Eric, I know you. You won the tournament at Waurika last week. You really fought well and in a strong division. I watched you on Saturday. You beat that kid from Wichita Falls with your left hook. You're a good fighter." Wawa reached over and planted a congratulatory poke on the outside of Eric's right shoulder, then teasingly crouched into his trademark defensive stance, with his fist up, as if anticipating a retaliatory blow. Eric smiled as he released a nervous breath of relief, surprised that Wawa had recognized him, but even more amazed that Wawa had watched him win the tourney the previous week. His confidence burgeoned quickly, feeling as though he had suddenly gained some measure of influence with regard to the issue of his brother's health. Eric raised his fist playfully in response to Wawa's posturing, and the two shadowboxed between the bench and the lockers. After a moment, they laughed, and Wawa sat down and began lacing up his boxing shoes in preparation for his match with Lynn. The jocular mood darkened, though, as Eric, seeking to leverage the strength of his new relationship with Wawa, launched into a plea for his brother's safety. "Wawa, you know, my brother Lynn is a pretty good fighter. I should know. We've been in lots of fights, and I've never won a single one. But he's no match for you, Wawa. You're the best boxer I've ever seen. I've watched you fight several times, and it always ends badly for the other guy. I just don't want that to happen to Lynn. I know you've never faced him before, and he's probably just another opponent to you, but to me, he's my brother. You're going to win. It's just a matter of how badly he gets hurt during the fight. So what I'd like to ask is for you to go easy on him. Whether it's a knockout or a decision, you'll still win. But if it's a decision, I'll get to keep my brother in one piece." Young Eric watched for some reaction from Wawa, but feedback was totally absent as he continued lacing his shoes. Then, after a few moments of silence, Wawa sat straight up and smiled slyly at Eric. "I'll think about it, Eric," Wawa said, as if attempting just to end the discussion. "Thanks," Eric replied. Their eyes locked for a full second before he turned and made his way out of the musty locker room toward the noisy crowd that filled the large arena. He had made an honest request. Now it was up to Wawa to grant it. Eric couldn't help but be optimistic about the conversation. After all, it was remotely possible that Lynn might have a better chance to win than had been surmised. Perhaps Wawa had never met an opponent of Lynn's caliber. Certainly having Dad in his corner would help. There were a dozen variables that could work in Lynn's favor. Then again,